All right, here we are again. Now I guess everybody is working on their midterm. Is anybody having any issues with it? No, it's pretty much what we were doing. I hope that it's very straightforward, self-explanatory even. That's good. That's exactly what we're hoping for. So the solutions, if you need them for the sample midterm, are right here. The actual midterm is right here. And remember, you should have it ready by next next Tuesday, right? No, what did I say? Um, I handed out last today's Tuesday. Oh, it must have been Friday.
Next Monday.
A week from Monday. That's it. All right, good. I wrote it down somewhere. I don't have it with me. All right, that sounds fine. All right, good. So let's carry on. Now we're looking at chapter 7, which is our discussion of inflation. And it just so happens that there's an unusually large number of very good videos available to us in this area. So we're going to watch some of them today, in addition to going through the notes. We've already watched two of these. What is inflation and what gives a dollar bill its value? But we've got some more to look at here. And I think you'll find them all to be extremely interesting. And in one case, or one or two cases, we're going to look at the consequences of runaway or hyperinflation. How does it happen? And what are the consequences? And we can see that nothing good can come of hyperinflation. All right. So let's go back and quickly review what we were doing. Of course, inflation refers to a consistent increase in price levels for just about all goods in the economy. The key there is that it's not enough for one or two items to become more expensive. Like once in a while, you'll notice that, gas prices will suddenly start going up again. If that's the only thing that's going up, we don't really think of that as inflation. Inflation is uh, a continuous increase in prices across the board for just about every good in the economy, not just one or two. Okay, so in order to consider ourselves to be having inflation, it must be true that the average price level is rising, and it applies to just about every good in the economy. Now, the Bureau of Labor Statistics every month publishes the exact increase in prices from the month before and from the year before, so we can keep an eye on how inflation is doing. And as you're probably aware, inflation was very, very low until maybe 6, 8 months ago, hovering around the 2% range for quite a few years, as a matter of fact. And now suddenly it is rearing its ugly head again, and prices are starting to go up fairly significantly in a lot of sectors. And so there's starting to become fears of shortages, and which could make things a lot worse. There's all kinds of negative things going on in the economy right now. The unemployment rate isn't really falling as quickly as we had hoped. New jobs are not being created as fast as we'd hoped. Prices are rising, energy costs are rising, food costs are rising. So a lot of bad things are happening at once here. It's like a bunch of black clouds decided to get together all at the same time and pour some rain on the economy. So if we look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, let's see if we can find that document that I was showing you last time. And we'll see that there's been a very sudden spike over the last few months. Let's see. Let's just quickly check this out. Here's CPI Home. This is the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And let's see, this is just general information. I would like to see. Oh, this only goes back to August. No, actually, it should go ahead of. Let's see what's going on here. Anyway, but what I would like you to see is that what they've actually done here is they've gone ahead and calculated the percentage change. Now, in August, the percentage change compared to the year before was about 5.3%, which is way higher than what it's been in the last 20, 30 years, where it had been hovering around 2.5%, going all the way back to at least the 80s. And now all of a sudden, we're up to 5.3%. Now, where is this coming from? Well, we have food, 3.7. Energy, this is where a lot of it is coming from, 25%. And when you strip those out, you get a number called the core CPI, which means everything except food and energy, and that's 4% for everything else, of which it looks like you can see here 31.9% used cars and trucks. you may have read that there's been a severe shortage of new cars available because a lot of factories had to close down during the COVID, and some of the important materials they need, like computer chips, are not yet readily available again. And so, because there's a severe shortage of new cars, that means people are trying to buy used cars. And of course, that means their prices are going to go up. So, used cars and trucks have gotten very, very expensive very recently for that reason. Now, eventually, that will turn itself around, but it takes time. And so overall, we can see that prices are rising much more quickly than they had been in previous years. Okay. Okay. Now, there's a chart in here somewhere I wanted to look at. If we can quickly find, see, there's a lot of good stuff here. The civilian labor force, productivity, which is something we'll address later on. Here's the CPI. All right, this must be the one we want. All right, let's get it. Here we are. Oh, but you know what? This is the actual CPI. These are not the percentage changes. So what we're seeing here is that as of August, the CPI was at 273.5667, which means that prices in the base year, remember, were 100. So prices are about 2.7 times what they were in the early 80s, which works out to about 2.5% per year, which is not terrible at all. In fact, prior to that, most of the time throughout the early 20th century, inflation was actually higher than that. In fact, throughout the world in recent years, inflation has gotten to very low levels, much lower than what had previously been the normal experience. So they probably also have a chart here which shows the percentage changes. Let's see if we can find that. Well, it's here somewhere. I don't want to waste all morning with this, but anything you need, it's in here somewhere. Now, if you notice, they don't just have the CPI. And by the way, this is the one, when you hear the word CPI in the media, this is what they're talking about. Urban consumers, all urban consumers. They also have other categories here. For example, this one is where they strip out the impact of food and energy because those are the most volatile components of the CPI. Down here we see PPI. We haven't talked about this yet. This is different. This is an index of the costs of the materials that are used by businesses to produce consumer goods and services. So in other words, raw materials like metals like steel and iron would go in here, or crude oil would go in here. Anything that is used by businesses to produce goods and services gets counted in the PPI, which stands for Producer Price Index. Now, this one is often taken as a signal as to where the CPI is likely to go in the future. Let's take a look at this. I want to see what it looks like. Because if the cost of doing business goes up, eventually prices will be higher for consumers. It might take a while. So if you look at here, for August, they've got 128.3. And you can see these numbers are quite a bit lower, but the base year is different here. So it's a little bit deceiving. But the idea here is that this shows us how much it's costing for businesses to produce goods and services. If this is rising rapidly, it's not good news for consumers, because sooner or later that will catch up with us in the form of higher prices for our own consumer goods. Okay, so what else is here that might be interesting? The employment cost index refers to how much does it cost employers to hire people, because wages are only part of the cost of hiring employees, because businesses have to pay for a lot of taxes. There's a lot of insurance involved, and there's a lot of other expenses like medical benefits and things like that. So the cost of hiring people is quite a bit higher than just the wages that are being paid. And so this is an indication of how much more it costs every year for businesses to hire new workers. They also have total hours. These are followed by economists. If the weekly hours are shrinking, that means people are being not working as much as they previously did. Even if they're not being laid off, they're still not working as much. And that's often a dangerous sign. So there's all kinds of great data here, but for this chapter, we're mainly focused on CPI. And remember, CPI consists of the goods that the Bureau of Labor Statistics thinks that a typical urban family of four might buy during a given year. So if you live in the city and you have, let's say, one sibling and your parents in the household, you are a typical urban family of four. Okay. And then whatever you buy gets counted in the basket that they've created. And so every month they go out and they reprice the items in the basket to see how much prices have gone up. All right. So we've already started to look at all these, but I just want to mention that there's several categories in here. These are the broad categories: food and beverages, housing, apparel, transportation, medical services. These obviously account for a very large percentage of our spending. Maybe not all of it, but certainly a very large percentage. So when these change in price, that's a pretty good sign that inflation is rising. Oh, and also, how could I forget recreation, education, and communication? These are also extremely important components of the market basket that's used by the Bureau of Labor Statistics to calculate the CPI. Altogether, there's 211 categories. That's a lot of categories. Okay. In other words, within each category, there's several subcategories. Like, for example, with food and beverages, they make a distinction between food that you buy in a restaurant and food that you cook at home. So each one of these major categories has several subcategories. So altogether, there's 211. By the way, here's an interesting question. What about housing? What if you don't own a house? What if you rent? Well, or what if you buy a house? Now, just interestingly enough, if you buy a house, what they do is they treat this as if you were renting the house to yourself. And they try to figure out how much rent you would be charging if somebody actually rented your house. So in other words, renting, it's obvious how much you're paying. But for owning a house, they try to estimate how much rent you could charge for that house. And they put that into the CPI. So I just thought you'd find that interesting. Anyway, so yes, they have to make a lot of, sometimes they have to use their judgment on these categories. Anyway, so finally, they also have to figure out what proportion of our incomes are spent on these different items. And they create what are called weights, because clearly most of our income goes into housing and food and beverages. So they should have higher weights. And so if housing prices go up, and even if everything else goes down, CPI could actually rise because we spend so much of our income on housing. So it's important to keep in mind what proportion of our income is spent on these goods. In fact, last time I showed you this chart, which I believe actually has the weights. Let's find out. All right, so, oh no, this is not what I thought it was. Oh, sorry about that. No, sorry, don't have it then. All right, no, maybe next time. But anyway, so we know the base year is the starting point for the CPI calculations. 100 is the base year CPI. That way we know how much prices have changed in any following year. We went through this example. I think we did. Did we do this example? I don't remember now. I don't think we did, now that I think about it. Imagine a small economy. And in 2016, all they have is fish and chips. Okay. It's a small island off of Great Britain where fish and chips is a very popular meal. And the chips, by the way, are French fries. The British call them chips. So it's fish, literally fish and French fries wrapped up in paper, and you eat it right out of the paper. It's kind of weird. And you can put ketchup in there if you want, but in Britain, they tend to use other condiments. So, but it's a very tasty thing to eat, and it's very popular over there. But let's just say this small island off the coast of Great Britain, off the coast of England, let's say, the Isle of Man, let's say, the fish cost $10 and the chips cost $4 per pound, let's say. And then the quantities are 100 and 150. So for this tiny island economy, it costs $1,600 to buy this market basket in 2016. Now, the next year, everything changes. Okay, they've redefined the basket. So it goes up to 1920. All right. So in principle, we should be able to figure out the CPI change. It went from 100 to 120. Okay, so that implies 20% inflation. All right, so that's really all there is to it. It's just that it's usually, this is a very simple example. Basically, you're just trying to capture the cost of the market basket in the 2 years. Now, CPI will always equal 100 in the base year. It will continue to rise as long as we have inflation. If we have deflation, CPI will actually fall. Yes, Fernando.
So you'll be able to determine the inflation by taking the difference between the initial like the initial price to the
Yes,
new.
it's actually the percentage. It's not the difference, it's the percentage difference.
Oh, because I know you said like 20% inflation. I just thought because it was 120 and it was 100. I just guessed like.
Oh, that's just a coincidence because we started at 100. When you're looking at the year after the base year, it'll always work that way. After that, it'll never be the same again. It'll always be a percentage difference. Like, let's just do a quick example here. In fact, I'll tell you what, why don't we look at, let's go back to our raw data. Why don't we do this just so you can see this with real numbers. Let's go back and download this data. And let's just pick, all right, how about this? August 2021. Whoops. We'll do that right now, just so you can see what it would look like in a different case. All right, so here's what's happening. August 21, CPI is 273, 273.567. And then the year before, it was 259. $259.918. So the CPI over that year, the inflation rate from August 20 to 21 would be the current CPI minus the previous CPI divided by the previous CPI. This is how a percentage change is always calculated. Think of this as the new value of this measure minus the original value divided by the original value. So you're going to have 273.567 minus 259.918 all over 259.918. And so let me get out my calculator here. In the numerator, we have 273.567 minus 259.918. So that's in the numerator 13.649 over the original, 259.918. And so what percentage does that represent? 0.0525. Yes, that's why. In fact, that's why they were saying in the printout there, the write-up of the results that, let's see, didn't they, somewhere back here, I think they mentioned it on the homepage, didn't they? I think they did. There it is. In August, the CPI for all urban consumers rose 0.3% on a seasonally adjusted basis, which translates into 5.3% over the last 12 months. So that's how they did that. They rounded it to 5.3, but they just calculated the percentage change from this August to last August. So over the past 12 months, inflation has been about 5.25. Yes, go ahead.
Oh yeah, I have another question. You said that after like literally right below, you would take that and then you would divide it by the previous year.
Yes,
Why would we do that? Like what is the reason?
that's how our percentage change is calculated. In other words, in the numerator, you have what we call the absolute change. So in other words, the prices went up. The CPI went up by 13.649 points. But that doesn't really help us a whole lot. We really want to know what that represents as a percentage. So that means it must be expressed as a percentage of the original value. You know, it's like, imagine if you told me, let me just do another type of example here. Suppose that last year you earned, and this is imagining that you've already graduated, $72,000. This year you will earn 94,000. What is the percentage increase in your salary? Well, it would be the same thing. It's the new salary minus old salary divided by old salary, which is 94 minus 72,000 over 72,000, which means your pay went up 22,000. Yeah, that's a nice little raise. And that as a percentage, we're looking at 30.56%. So that means you probably got a promotion. You've been moved up in the chain to something higher up. Before you were the assistant to the regional manager, and now you're the regional manager or something like that. Okay, so this is how we calculate percentage changes. It's the absolute change divided by the original value. And that's always how percentage changes work. So inflation is simply a percentage change in the CPI. All right, that's all that it means. How much did the CPI go up compared to what it was last year? All right, and it's always on a year-to-year basis. That's what we want to know. 5.25% means per year. Now, if you want to look at the year before, now if you look at August 20 versus August 19, oh, let's see. Oh man, what do we have here? Oh, look what we found. All right, let's wake it up. This might be what I was looking for earlier. Let's see what, there we go. Okay, well, this is the categories. This is actually what I wanted a little while ago. I just wanted to point out that it's hard to believe that there's 211 categories, but you can see let's keep going here. Well, oh man, it's more than that. Look at that. Oh no, there's a bunch of footnotes, but yes, there's an awful lot of categories here. So in other words, the basic categories, these are indexes. There's a lot of stuff here, but they really can get very, very detailed here. But the basic categories never change. They start out with food and energy. These are the ones that fluctuate the most. So in other words, even when the economy is not really experiencing any inflation, food and energy prices can fluctuate anyway. They're just because of the way they're produced. You know, there can be supply shortages, there can be disruptions, there can be all kinds of issues. So food prices and energy prices can fluctuate quite a bit, even when prices in the rest of the economy are stable. So that's why economists sometimes don't look at the overall CPI. They look at the so-called core CPI, which essentially covers everything else, because they feel that it's a more meaningful look at the rate of inflation over an extended period of time. In fact, they probably had it in that list of tables. There's all kinds of good stuff here. If you want to learn about what they're doing, oh man, you could even write to them. I wouldn't bother them unless it's really important, but still. Um, Here we go. See, this is a classic example of what I'm talking about. You see this chart? It's got all items, 5.3%, which we calculate ourselves. Then they have just food, just energy. And this one, which is 4.0%, what they've done is they've stripped out the food and the energy. This is everything else. And you notice how the CPI, this is the so-called core CPI, and it's only 4%, which means that some of our inflation rate is coming from food and energy. And so it's good to have both numbers to look at because, like I said, you can have a case where there's almost no inflation in the overall economy, and yet food and energy prices are going up or down. And so it's often helpful to look at both of them. And for economists who are following these numbers over extended periods of time, they do want to look at both of them because they feel that the core CPI is a more meaningful measure of long-term inflation trends. These bounce around so much that they, make it harder to see what's going on in the long run. Okay. What else do we have here? I don't know. Publications, all kinds of stuff. So yeah, this is really, oh, look at this. They have classroom materials. Games and quizzes, although this is meant for high school, but still, it might be, maybe one day we'll investigate this. Games and quizzes. I don't know. How much fun would that be to play a game about inflation? But who knows? Look at this. They see, I mean, who would, their job is to create statistics, and yet they've got all these wonderful resources for teachers. That's pretty cool, I think. Wow. And it's all free, of course, because taxpayers paid for all of this. So, all right, anyway, let's get back to this. Now, of course, CPI isn't perfect, just like GDP. There's a lot of issues. Now, first things first, the base year hasn't been changed in almost 40 years now. So that leads to a lot of potential issues. For example, what do they do about goods that were only just invented recently? Well, that's a real problem. Where would you put iPhones in this chart? I don't know what they do about that. I think I'd have to look more deeply into that, but my suspicion is that they just make some kind of an estimate. But I mean, the basket itself is getting a little outdated because they've been using it for so long. And so they're probably missing out on, number one, there are probably entire goods that they're not even capturing. And number two, they're probably not taking into account, and how could they, that the goods themselves are becoming better all the time. So in other words, if you had the iPhone 11 and 12 and they're the same price, that doesn't reflect the fact that consumers are better off with the iPhone 12 because even though the price is the same, the quality is improved. So the CPI is not able to capture quality improvements, which is a very important component of our standards of living. And also, right, quality, and also another thing is this. Now, this is a big issue. The weights themselves don't change very often. They're assuming that that famous urban family of four is buying the same things that they were 10, 20 years ago. So what happens if we find ourselves buying more, let's say, organic products and less of other products in the supermarket? Well, this is not going to pick that up because it's assuming that the weights haven't changed, at least not for many years. So that's another real problem. And also what happens is when something becomes more expensive, people are likely to switch to other substitutes for that good. And they're not capturing that either because the weights don't change very often. So the net effect of all this is to overstate the true cost of living. Like here's an example. If chicken suddenly goes up in price, the CPI will reflect that. But what it's not going to reflect is that people may substitute beef for chicken. And so as a result, the cost of living went up less than it appears based on the fact that chicken became more expensive. And so all of these different problems combine to create a measure which tends to overstate the true increase for the cost of living. Now, how much? Oh, and by the way, the reason why this can be a problem is because a lot of financial arrangements are based on the CPI rather. For example, union contracts that have a cost of living clause are typically tied to the CPI. And certainly Social Security checks depend on the CPI. They do go up when CPI goes up. And also in the tax code, a lot of the deductions are increased automatically according to the CPI. So a lot of important transactions can be distorted if the CPI is not completely accurate. Now, on the other hand, the good news is that the Bureau of Labor Statistics is constantly working to upgrade the CPI. They made a lot of fixes to it over the years, and they've reduced the problem to a certain degree. And in fact, even now, the general consensus among economists is that CPI tends to overstate inflation by about 0.1%, which, you might say, well, that's not bad. And it isn't bad, but still remember, it still affects all of these contracts. And so it would be nice if it was exactly correct, but 0.1% in the grand scheme of things is not a huge difference. So, but it used to be worse. In other words, it used to be more overstated than it is now. So a lot of technical changes have been made to it. They're too complex for us to go into them right now, but they're constantly working. They know that there's problems with it, so they're constantly working on ways to improve it. And if you really wanted to read about that, it's here somewhere. Somewhere on this website, there are papers where they explain to you how they've improved the CPI measurement in recent years. It's very, very complicated. It's not something you dabble in. Let's just say I wouldn't just casually look at one of these papers unless you're really serious about it. Like if you have to write a paper for one of your classes. But it's good to know that they're on the job. They're working on improving the CPI. And the same thing can be said for GDP. Remember, we talked about how it has problems. So by the way, there's also other versions of the CPI that they're working on. The core is the one I mentioned earlier, which is the one that leaves out food and energy. The chaining is a different way of calculating the percentage changes. And this personal consumption expenditures is a little broader than what we're seeing with the regular CPI. It attempts to capture every single good that is included in the consumer component of GDP. It also is updated more often than the regular CPI. So this personal consumption expenditures index is a newer version of CPI, but it hasn't completely caught on yet. In other words, when you hear it in the media, CPI is this number or that number, we're looking at the traditional CPI measure, but a lot of economists look at this one too, because it's newer and likely to be, at least it's updated more often, so it may be more accurate as far as quality improvements go or new goods and services. Kind of like when remember there were 6 unemployment measures, 1 through 6, they all have strengths and weaknesses. Eventually, I guess they'll come up with a new CPI that incorporates all these benefits, but right now we're still using the old one. And, eventually they'll have to change the base year too, because after a while, when you're using a base year in the 80s, you're really essentially saying that the economy hasn't changed much since the 80s. And that's obviously not the case. So somewhere down the road, they're going to announce one day that we changed the base year after incorporating all these changes. And then we'll see how much of an improvement that makes. Now, nominal and real. We've already learned about what nominal and real mean. Real means something is adjusted for inflation. Nominal means we're looking at current values, current prices. So let's say, now, by the way, this is how you can calculate, another way you can calculate real and nominal values. Imagine the following scenario. We bought a house in 1990 for $100,000 and we sold it for $220,000 in 2017. Now, the CPI will assume was 120 in 1990 and 182 in 2017. So clearly, the value of the house didn't really double, did it? At least not in real terms. The price in terms of dollars went up more than double. But how much did it go up in real terms? That's the question. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take the 2017 actual price, the nominal price, and we're going to multiply that by the ratio of the two CPIs. In other words, we're going to reduce it to indicate or try to measure it in not 2017 prices, but 1990 prices. And so you can see that the real price based on this measure is only about $145,000. So that's still a nice increase. Okay, but it's not as much as it appears by looking at the nominal prices. Oops, I don't know why I made that red there, but that means the price went up, and this is again a percentage increase in terms of real terms from the new price of the house minus the original price over the original price, about 45%. In nominal terms, it went up by about 120%. So that means during that period, prices went up by approximately 75% because the nominal increase is 120, the real increase is about 45%. The difference between the two is 75%, and that means that part of the increase in the price of the house reflects higher prices in the economy. All right. Let's see. Let me just see what's coming up. Oh, real versus nominal applies to other areas as well. Like, what about wages? Nominal wages are those that are currently being paid. They're measured in current dollars. That's how your paycheck actually says. Real wages are paid in fixed or base year dollars. And the reason why this matters is because you want to know if you're keeping up with inflation, or in other words, if your purchasing power is actually going up. Oh, okay. I thought I might have an example there, but basically you can do the same thing we did with the house. You can adjust these wages to the CPI and see if your income is actually growing or not in real terms. And then interest rates too, we can do the same thing with interest rates. Nominal interest rates are the ones we observe in the marketplace. Real interest rates have been adjusted for inflation. And real interest rates can be negative if the inflation rate is higher than the nominal rate. So formally, here's how this would work. Suppose that a bank is paying a 5% rate of interest while the rate of inflation is 3%. So your nominal interest rate is 5%, of course. But because your purchasing power is being reduced by 3%, your actual increase in purchasing power is only 2% approximately. And so therefore, we would say that the real rate of interest in this bank account is actually 2%. And so when it comes to long-term planning and saving for your retirement, for example, that's the number that really matters. Okay. In other words, yes, 5% is what you're getting, but 3% is wiped out by inflation. So you're really getting a 2% increase in your purchasing power, which we call the real rate of interest. So in principle, just about any value in the economy could be measured in both real and nominal terms. But the ones we typically use are GDP, interest rates, and wages. Those are the ones where it really matters a great deal. Fernando, yes.
Yes, I have a question. So could you say that nominal interest rates and real, or I guess yeah, nominal interest rates and real interest and the real interest rates when you're explaining that the nominal, could you say like the nominal would be like the general, like, oh, this is like how much you're generally getting, but realistically, specifically, you're getting that because you're getting 3% wiped off out of that 5%.
Right. So yes. So if the nominal rate of interest is 5%, which is you're actually getting that, and inflation is 3%, the real rate of interest, which means the increase in purchasing power, is 5 minus 3%, which is 2%. Now, interestingly enough, suppose instead that inflation is 6%. The real rate is 5% minus 6%, which is negative 1%. You're losing 1% on your purchasing power. So you can see in this case, the real rate is actually negative. And so that can happen when inflation is rising, because what will typically happen is interest rates don't change that quickly. If you put your money in the bank in the past and now inflation suddenly starts heating up, your real rates of return might be dropping into negative territory. So while nominal rates are very rarely negative, real rates can be negative if inflation is rising. And that's going to make it much harder for you to save and invest and especially plan for your retirement. So inflation is very, very harmful across the board, but especially to savers because it significantly reduces their purchasing power. So that's something to take into account when we invest our money in the future, why people instead of putting all their money in the bank might put a lot of it in the stock market or buy real estate or whatever the case may be, because those are areas where you're less likely to lose your returns to inflation. But that's a discussion for another day. You know, how do you invest your money? But it's important to be aware of this distinction between nominal and real rates, because the real rates are the one that refer to your actual increase in purchasing power, which is what really matters. Okay, sometimes you get these countries with really high inflation rates, and they'll offer you some, like in Turkey, not that long ago, you can get 50% on your savings account. But the inflation rate was almost 60%. So how did that help? So yes, so what really matters in the long run is the real rate. The thing is, though, you can't actually look in the newspaper and see the real rate of interest. You have to figure it out yourself from the rate of inflation. So you have to know how this works. The nominal rates are what you're actually seeing in the bank. Yes, Fernando.
In what kind of situation could you say that inflation is good? Like, because I know we talked about inflation previously from other classes saying
Oh,
that it can be good, but what kind of example?
inflation, I'll tell you what, inflation is helpful to borrowers, though. If you borrow, like for example, imagine you borrow, let's make up an example here. Suppose you buy a house and your mortgage rate, the rate you pay on your loan, is 5%. Fine. Now, time goes by, inflation reaches 7%, and your wages increase by exactly 7%. Let's say your boss gives you 7% a year to compensate you for inflation, to maintain constant purchasing power. In real terms, the real rate on your mortgage is negative 2%. You're actually being able to pay your loan back with cheaper dollars. In other words, that 5% never changes because you've locked it in when you bought the house, but your salary can go up if inflation rises. And so what's happening is that you have more dollars to repay a fixed amount of debt. And so if you're a borrower, this is actually working in your favor. Okay, does everyone see how that works? A lender, the bank in this case, is the one that's getting hammered because the dollars that they're being repaid with are worth less than they were when you signed this contract. So they're losing out. You're the one who benefits because you're being allowed to pay your debts back with cheaper dollars. So inflation helps borrowers. It hurts lenders. But in general, inflation is harmful in other ways because it distorts information. Pricing is very useful for generating or providing information to consumers and producers. Consumers, because it helps them figure out what to buy to maximize the value of their dollars. But for producers, prices help them determine how much of each product to produce to maximize their profits. And so inflation distorts all that information. It makes it harder for planning to take place. It's harder for companies to decide how much to produce. And then what starts to happen too is that companies will start raising prices because they are afraid that inflation might go up. Even if it doesn't, they start raising their prices. And before you know it, all prices are rising at the same time because we expect more inflation in the future. And once that gets started, it's hard to stop it. So in fact, one of the videos we're going to look at will explain exactly that, how inflation starts to feed on itself and it starts to increase to very, very high levels very quickly. And it's very, very destructive ultimately to everyone. I mean, in the short run, yes, borrowers might be happy, but in the long run, inflation is harmful to everyone. So, and this is a great tie into the videos we're about to look at. We're going to look at a country that about 12, 13 years ago experienced a preposterously high level of inflation. And we're going to understand how this could have happened. Okay. And why sometimes governments are resorting to doing this kind of thing. And so you might have heard about the hyperinflation that ruined Germany after World War One. If not, it'll probably come up in the videos. But we're going to see how, an extreme case of when inflation really gets completely out of control. So why don't we go check that out? We're done with this chapter, by the way. There's nothing new in here. So what we're going to do now is switch over to our wonderful videos, which I've discovered on the internet, which every time I look at the net, I'm finding more and more of these great videos. And it's really amazing, the quality of this stuff. And it's all for free. It's amazing. So we're going to start with this one called Zimbabwe and inflation. So that's the country I was alluding to earlier. Zimbabwe, as you know, is in Southern Africa. And this is about the late 2000s, 2008, I think this will be. Their inflation rate was absolutely beyond belief. So we're going to take a look at this and see how this happens. Okay. So, all right. Now, keep in mind, this is an extreme case. This happens just not often at all. It might not happen more than once in a single century, but this is the kind of thing that can happen if the government makes very bad decisions. Okay, so first let me share this with you by the chat, and let's check this out. Be prepared to be horrified. Okay, all right, here we go.
It's not easy being a dictator. For one, there's a lot of other people around you who would love to be you, so you're constantly worrying about staying in power. Navigating the gray area between political rivals and political allies is a total headache. Plus, there's all those pesky people who you're supposed to be in charge of. How to give them as little as possible without inciting rebellion is a never-ending balancing act. Robert Mugabe, the president of Zimbabwe, was facing these problems around 2000. He needed money to bribe his enemies and reward his allies. Unfortunately, he had taxed pretty much everything there was to tax, and his policies had scared away investors. The economy wasn't doing well, and his people were unemployed and hungry. So, where to get the money? Well, one of the perks of running a country is that you get your very own money-making machine, the printing presses. So, in a pinch, you can just print more money, which is exactly what Mugabe did. The newly printed money didn't increase productivity in the Zimbabwean economy, and there was no new investment, so the economy couldn't produce more goods. In effect, you had more money chasing the same goods. More money chasing the same goods meant that the purchasing power of the Zimbabwean dollar fell. You needed more dollars to buy the same stuff as before. In other words, as the newly printed money began flooding the market, prices began to rise. Prices began to increase at a rate of about 50% a year, and that was only the beginning. As prices rose, the government had to print even more money to buy just as many goods as before. And so they did. And that is how things got out of control. The faster prices rose, the more money the government printed. And the faster prices rose, a feedback loop. By 2001, prices were rising at a rate of 100% per year. By 2002, 200% per year. 2003, 600% per year. By 2006, prices were rising at over 1,000% per year, and it cost 417 Zimbabwean dollars to buy toilet paper. No, not per roll, $417 per sheet. Money was devaluing so quickly that the money you had in the morning would be worth quite a bit less by the evening. So people were trying to get rid of currency as soon as they got it. Zimbabweans became millionaires, but unfortunately, $1 million Zimbabwe dollars might buy you a chicken if you were lucky. And still the government kept printing money. and in higher and higher denominations. $1 million notes, 100 million, 10 billion, $100 billion notes. In 2008, prices started rising by thousands of percent a month, and the government started printing $100 trillion notes. At the height of this feedback loop, prices were increasing at an astronomical rate of 7.6 billion% a month. And $1 would get you, well, we're not sure how to say it, but this many Zimbabwean dollars. By the end of 2008, the Zimbabwean dollar had effectively ceased to exist, and Mugabe had no choice but to legalize transactions in foreign currencies. The Zimbabwe hyperinflation was over. Hyperinflations have occurred in other countries such as Yugoslavia in 1994, China in 1949, and Germany in 1923. As in Zimbabwe, these hyperinflations were caused by governments that were desperate for cash, but with few means to raise funds except the printing presses. The Zimbabwe hyperinflation also illustrates a more general principle that we will be exploring and testing in greater detail in upcoming videos. And that is, inflation is caused by increases in the supply of money. You're on your way to mastering economics. Make sure this video sticks by taking a few practice questions. Or if you're ready for more macroeconomics, click for the next video. Still here? Check out Marginal Revolution University's other popular
So are you appalled? Was that horrifying? Yes. Now, by the way, if you're interested, yes, Deveray.
I think it's so interesting because a lot of people think, oh, you can just print more money to, help the economy and stuff like that. But then you don't realize like what it does to the economy when you just like print more money and not solve anything.
Exactly, because the money itself, it means nothing unless something is being produced that we can buy with it. And so this is the mistake these countries are making, that they think that more money means more people are wealthier, but it doesn't mean any such thing. It just means the relationship between prices and the goods is different. The number of goods hasn't changed. And then a lot of people find that their savings become worthless overnight, and people waste all their time trying to spend the money as soon as they get it. You hear stories about people in some of these countries that have had hyperinflation demanding to be paid every hour so that they can go shopping and spend it all right away because they know that it'll lose all of its value by the end of the day. All kinds of crazy stories have come out from some of these cases. Like in Germany, people would go to a restaurant and buy a meal, and by the time the check came, the price would have gone up because inflation was so rapid. So yes, this is really, you can see, but of course, this is a very extreme case, but even small increases in printing money can lead to a lot of inflation as well. So Fernando?
By any chance, would this have like any relation to like why it's illegal to print money?
No. They don't want
Besides
people
the
to
thing
print money
today.
because then you could do whatever you want with it, and you could I mean, the last thing in the world they want is counterfeit money floating around. Nobody would know what anything was worth, and we would lose complete confidence in our money, and the economy could collapse if we. In fact, here's an interesting twist. Now you mentioned counterfeiting. There's a movie that you might want to investigate in this very subject area. I see what I can do here. If I can find the title, this is it. It was all okay. The title was Nothing. It's called The Counterfeiters. Now, what is this all about? During World War II, the Germans came up with a strategy, and they thought, here's what we can do. We want to win this war, but we'll use any techniques that are available to us. We want to, of course, we have a powerful military and all, but anything we can do to speed up the end of World War II, we're going to take it. And so they hit on this scheme where they would destroy the British economy by flooding England with counterfeit pound notes. And so they had, in all these slave labor camps, people were sitting there literally making pound notes. The idea was to, drop them into England, and then all of a sudden, all these counterfeit paper notes are floating around. And then the economy could literally collapse because nobody would know which notes were good and which ones were bad. So they really got pretty far with this plan. And in fact, I've been to the Bank of England, and they have a museum, and they actually had a few examples of these counterfeit notes that the Germans produced, and they look pretty good. But here's the clever strategy that the British government employed to put a stop to this. What they did was they said, on a temporary basis, we're going to withdraw from circulation all notes that are worth more than £1. So why was that a helpful strategy? Because it meant that the Germans now had to focus on £1 notes if they meant to counterfeit them. And in order to sabotage the entire British economy, the number of £1 notes they would have needed would have been astronomical. So that helped put a stop to this. But this movie is about this actual operation carried out by the Germans to try to destroy the British economy through counterfeiting. It's really well done if you're interested in this. And they also were working on a plan to do the same thing with the US dollar, but it never quite got that far because the war ended before they could really get it going. So, but their focus in the beginning was England. They couldn't seem to conquer England, no matter what they did. And so they just thought, well, here's something else we could try. Why don't we just destroy their economy? And we can do that with counterfeiting. So they tried their best. Now, of course, they did not succeed, as we know, but I think you'd find this to be an extremely interesting movie. And along the way, it's not just dramatic and interesting, but it's also, you'll also learn about what they were actually doing and how they hope to succeed. And it's actually one of these movies that got very little publicity at the time, but I think it's well worth checking it out, especially for economics students. So there it is. You know, if you have a room in your Netflix queue for this, you might as well go check it out because I think you'll really like it. I don't know if there are any big names in this movie. No, not really, but believe me, you'll like it. Especially if you didn't know that any of this had happened, you'll say, hey, wait a minute. How do you like that? How did this not get more publicity? It was meant to be a secret, of course, but the British decided they didn't want it publicized either because they didn't want to scare the public. Instead, like I said, they withdrew from circulation all the larger notes so that if the Germans wanted to flood the country with counterfeit notes, they would have had to do it £1 at a time. So there it is if you want to check it out. Anyway, so counterfeiting, no, we don't want counterfeiting. We don't want people printing their own notes. And what I was going to say, suppose you're a collector, you collect notes and coins, and you say to yourself, you know, that $100 trillion bill was pretty cool. Where can I buy one? Oh, here we go. There's all kinds of companies out there. The Great American Coin Company, for example, you can have one of your own. It's uncirculated, only about $250. Well, now, of course, that means you better be a serious collector, but still, there they are if you want one. Sure, why not? Is anyone tempted? Oh, they've got all kinds of fun stuff here. You'd be surprised if you look at currencies throughout the world. Some of the designs are unbelievable. But so yes, it's a collector's item now. I don't think we'll ever see another one larger than this, but you never know. $100 trillion. This, if I remember correctly, this was enough to buy a loaf of bread by the time the hyperinflation reached its peak. $100 trillion. So everybody in Zimbabwe was basically a trillionaire, but they were one of the poorest countries in the world because inflation was so high. All right, well, anyway, so now the next video, it's basically a follow-up to what we were just talking about, the $100 trillion note. Okay, so let's take a look at this. All right, let me send you the link. Oh my God, what is all that? I've accidentally found another toolbar here, and I have no idea what this is all doing here. Huh. I'll check it out later on. All right, so here's the link. All right, let's do it.
Future happens when we explore new frontiers. Gemini is the future of finance. Invest in over.
Imagine you're playing a game of Monopoly. Everyone begins with $1,500, and as you travel around the board, players compete to purchase properties of varying prices, from Old Kent Road at $60 all the way up to Mayfair at $400. The aim is then to own a complete set of properties and purchase houses and hotels in order to charge other players rent and ultimately bankrupt them, eliminating them from the game. However, you've made some pretty bad decisions and things aren't going very well at all. So what do? Do you play on and simply hope for the best? Do you flip the board over in a fit of rage, sending tiny pieces of plastic and metal flying around the living room? Or do you sneak away when nobody's looking and print more money? Let's suppose you pick the latter and print yourself a nice round sum of $10,000. Suddenly the game's most valuable property, with its highest potential rent of $2,000, seems like pocket change to you. And as you navigate the board, carelessly landing on owned properties and paying their rent with ease, the overall quantity of money present in the game increases. Now everyone has more money, not just you, but there's fundamentally still the same amount of goods available. And because of this, the purchasing power of your money falls, and in response, the cost of everything rises. Old Kent Road is now worth $120, double what it used to be, and Mayfair is now $800. The money you have is now worth less than it was, and everything has gone up in price. But don't worry, you can just print more money, this time $50,000. But the same thing happens again. There's a lot more money floating around in the game, and so it loses its purchasing power. Old Kent Road now costs $1,500, and Mayfair has reached an enormous 5 figures. And yeah, you might physically have a lot more money, but it's worth significantly less. And so you print more and more and more. $100,000, $250,000, $500,000, and as its purchasing power falls and prices rise to match, that number just gets bigger and bigger. 1 million, 10 million, 100 million, and then you hit 10 figures, 1 billion, 10 billion, 100 billion. You get the idea. Well, this is called hyperinflation, if a little oversimplified, and it's more or less what happened in Zimbabwe in the late 90s and early 2000s. The government had made a series of bad decisions and introduced some alarmingly short-sighted policies, the most prominent of which being land reform. The president, Robert Mugabe, seized white-owned farms and gave control of them to black Zimbabweans in the hope of addressing the wrongs of British colonial rule. However, most of these new owners knew almost nothing about farming, and production subsequently plummeted. There was significantly less food and the population was starving. And what's more, Mugabe had debts and ridiculous expenses of his own, and no money with which to pay them. So like in our game of Monopoly, Mugabe came up with the bright idea of simply printing more money. But as we've already seen, now there was just more money chasing the same finite amount of goods, which meant its purchasing power fell. A loaf of bread might have cost, say, $1, but now cost $5. Printing more money hadn't magically addressed the lack of bread, just increased its price. But nonetheless, he printed more and more money, and soon it got so extreme that the cost of bread was now in the thousands, and then the tens of thousands, and then the hundreds of thousands. But it kept going. He printed money so quickly and in such vast quantities that it devalued with unimaginable speed. We're talking days or even hours. As money flooded the market and costs dramatically increased, people were desperate to get rid of their cash as quickly as they possibly could, because even that evening it could be worth half of what it was in the morning. And yet the government kept on going. And whilst the banknotes grew in number of zeros, their purchasing power plummeted even quicker, and the cost of everything skyrocketed to match. Bread now costs literally millions, but even then it just kept on going. And soon those millions turned into billions, and then into trillions. As ridiculous and disastrous as it may have been, out of the whole fiasco were born some pretty unique banknotes. Now, I do need to thank banknoteworld.com for providing these notes. They came in this cool presentation folder, and although this isn't a sponsored video, they did send me these for free, for which I am very grateful. They even have a super interesting YouTube channel themselves. The first is a $10 trillion bill. That's 13 zeros. And as well as a lot of zeros, the front of the note also features the Chiremba Balancing Rocks, a naturally occurring geological wonder near the country's capital, Harare. These rock formations are incredible and are intended to represent environmental protection, development, and prosperity for the country, something they spectacularly fell short of. The front also features a Zimbabwe bird in colour-changing ink, the national emblem of Zimbabwe as seen on the country's flag. And towards the left, there's a security strip again in colour-changing ink, repeating RBZ, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe. In terms of microprint, there's not really a lot going on, as can only be expected of a banknote mass-produced on such short notice. But interestingly, the only microprint I could see appears to have a typo. The border of the rectangle to the right of the rocks is made up of tiny numbers, which actually read 100 trillion, not 10 trillion. Again, I'd imagine this is a product of the rush nature of these notes. On the right of the note, there's a feature called the see-through register, where the denomination is partially printed on the front and the remainder on the reverse, so that when held up to a light source, the image is complete. It's a security feature which makes them harder to counterfeit, as criminals have trouble lining the two sides up accurately. And lastly, there's an underprint image of a cow and some wheat grains, seen more easily when exposed to UV light. On the reverse, there's an image of the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe's headquarters, the country's tallest building at 120 meters in height, in stark contrast to the ruins of Great Zimbabwe shown on the right. Great Zimbabwe was the country's capital, built almost a millennium ago, but was abandoned and fell into ruin in the 15th century. The 50 trillion is almost identical on the front, except for a slightly different shade of green. The reverse sees the Kariba Dam, a gigantic curved concrete dam that straddles the border between Zimbabwe and Zambia, and sits at the northern shore of Lake Kariba, the world's largest man-made lake. There's also an African bush elephant, the largest living terrestrial animal, native to much of Zimbabwe in Central and Southern Africa. Finally, the 100 trillion again is almost identical to the 10 and 50, except in colour, and the number of zeros on this is again just absurd. The reverse features Victoria Falls, regarded as the world's largest waterfall, again sitting on the border between Zimbabwe and Zambia. The waterfall was named in honour of Queen Victoria, although many still know it by its indigenous name, the Smoke That Thunders. And on the right is a Cape buffalo, again found over much of Central and Southern Africa. In fact, both the elephant and buffalo can be seen on the banknotes of neighbouring South Africa. By 2009, hyperinflation had got so extreme that even $100 trillion were rendered completely worthless, giving the country no choice but to abandon the Zimbabwe dollar. Foreign currencies started being accepted instead, including the US dollar, the South African rand, and the euro. And as a result, consumer prices finally began to stabilise. Today, these currencies continue to be used. Once again, I just want to say thank you to Banknote World for sending me these for free, and I really hope you enjoyed the video.
So of course, in this case, the focus was more on the bills themselves, which is interesting because you look at them and the way they're designed, and there's still even, like you said, they were in a rush to get these printed up, but they still have a lot of security features that would have been unthinkable even 10 years ago. So if you're interested, this particular individual makes a lot of videos about coins and notes throughout the world. So right there. Wait a minute, I can't make it go down. Yes, Fernando.
Is Zimbabwe still experiencing hyperinflation?
No,
to this day?
no, that I believe that we can find out, but I'm pretty sure that was the end of it. Let's try this. Zimbabwe inflation last 30 years, let's say. Oh, okay. By their standards, it says here that they averaged 82.85%. That's per year from 2009, right after the hyperinflation was ended by using foreign currencies until 2021. But during that period, it got as high as 37.53% in July of 2020, and then minus 7.50 in December 2009. So by their standards, it's very low now. But by the rest of the world standards, it's still ridiculously high. But partially that's because the economy still isn't able to produce all the goods and services that they need. It's just that the prices are more stable because everything's quoted in dollars and, like you said, in rand and euros. And that's always a sign. Any country where the inflation is completely out of control will eventually find people using other currencies. Like, for example, in Venezuela, right now, the inflation rate is I think it's over 1,000% now. And let's see, I think that 28.5 is per month. Annual, right? Because the annual rate is 27.19%. Okay, so this is this article was written this summer. So the annual rate is about 2,719%. And the minimum wage is now equivalent to about $3 per month. So yeah, so in other words,